started, if you need a bulletin, Todd's still back there on the back, so a place to take some notes as we dive into our second week in the series that we began last week. And so as we kind of begin talking about our conversation for today, as many of you all know, I drive a school bus here in town. And many of you, when I've had conversations about driving a school bus, you articulate that, you don't mind driving a big yellow hunk of metal, but it's what you're hauling that gives you some angst. And believe it or not, most days aren't that bad, but there are some days it can get a little chaotic, right? I've had times where, objects are thrown, kids yell. I've had times where they literally try to play tag in the bus, and I'm like, what in the world are you guys doing? And there was actually one morning where some student brought this glitter, and they opened it up, and all the windows are down the bus. It literally was a glitter whirlwind. I got home that day, and I'm like, I'm getting in the shower. This stuff is all over me, right? And so on some occasions, it's a little chaotic, and so what the school will do to help to control that chaos, not only just because it's just a little wild, but there's also a safety concern there, right? If they're up and out of their seats, and heaven forbid, right, we get in an accident, it can cause some serious damage. And so on some occasions, the school will have a monitor that will ride with you. And here's the thing, it's kind of funny, having another adult in that bus changes the environment, right? Honestly, they could sit there and not say a single word to the kids, but just their mere presence changes the environment of that bus, right? Their presence changes the environment. And this is kind of what I want to talk about today, this topic of presence. Because presence changes our environments as well, right? Presence changes everything, right? This is literally what we celebrate as a church as we gather every Sunday, right? The incarnation of Jesus, right? The presence of God here on earth, right? When he showed up in human form. So we celebrate presence. We understand its value. And just like presence changes the environment on a school bus with a bunch of kids with just a lot of energy, presence changes the environment in our relationships as well. He's showing up and being there physically is incredibly important, particularly in our romantic relationships. In fact, maybe some of you are here today and you're in a relationship, right? You're in a marriage and your relationship is struggling because you have fundamentally discounted the importance of showing up and literally being present. And sometimes it's easy for us to get so busy, attempting to be all things to all people, that we discount that most important element of presence. And as many of you all know, it's not just about showing up, right? Showing up is part of the importance of presence, but the other level of presence is a level of intimacy that's shared when you get together, right? On that school bus, right? Showing up and having someone there usually solves 90% of the problems, but sometimes they have to make a connection with the kids to tell them, cut it out. And in the same way in our relationships, it's not just about showing up, it's about making a deeper connection, right? And again, that's what we celebrate as a church. Jesus showed up here on earth, but he also made a connection with us as well. And as you know, you can spend all day with somebody and not feel close to them. But on the other hand, you could spend maybe a few minutes a day with someone in an intentional way where you connect, and you can certainly feel much closer. So what I want us to kind of talk about today, this is where our text kind of guides us, is just the mistakes sometimes that we make when we talk about presence. Because sometimes we mistake presence for depth and connection. Right? Showing up, again, it's incredibly important. You need to show up in life. You need to show up in your relationships. But that's just part of the battle. There also needs to be a level of depth and connection that takes place. And I think this is important for all of us, particularly those in marriage relationships, because sometimes we're encountering issues not because we're not just simply showing up, but we're not connecting with our partners. And so, as we dive into the second week in our series talking about, right, what is love, what we're going to be focusing on is how do we facilitate depth and connection in our relationships. And so just a little reminder of a series we began last week entitled Love Is. We're walking through the book of Song of Solomon. We're in week 2 out of 8. And we're just evaluating what Scripture says about love. Because this book is targeted at people who are seriously dating, engaged, and married. And even though the focus is primarily on romantic relationships, the principles we find here overflow into many other areas of our life. And so today we'll be in Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5 through 7. Feel free to kind of flip there. It might create some context for you as well if you're looking at a different translation. Because it's just a few verses, I'll have them up on the screen for us. But we're in Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5 through 7. Kind of just, again, wrestling with that question, right? How do we kind of create depth and connection in our relationships? And so, again, there's a place in the back of your bulletin to take some notes, and I will prompt you to fill them in a moment. Now, before we dive into our text, just kind of prepare us for what we're going to look at. I've talked to you guys a lot about the car that Paige used to have, right? It was a car that she had, I think, in high school, and she had it when we got married, and this car and I got pretty connected, right? Not in necessarily ways because I wanted to, but because I spent a lot of time working on it. And eventually it came to a point in time where it made sense to get rid of it. And so I had it up for sale, and I remember the guy that came to look at it there when we were living in Dallas. And I spent some time showing him around the car, and I spent a lot of time telling him about all the things about the car, right? The good things, right? Great gas mileage. It's easy to pick up parts for this thing. Tires are cheap, right? It was cheap to drive. But I feel like I spent an overwhelming amount of time telling him about all the issues I was aware of it. Right, all the things I'd replaced, all the things that were kind of on my radar that might be problems, right? It was a 25-year-old car with, gosh, almost 300,000 miles, right? You're going to be happy if you make it to A and B. But I spent all that time telling him about the problems that the car had, not because I was trying to, lose the sale of the car, but I didn't want him to feel blindsided by anything later on. Right? I didn't want him to think this was a pristine car that he could take across the country. Right? I gave him everything I knew about the car because I wanted him to know about this vehicle he's about to step into. Even if I had to lose the sale, right? I wanted him to know. And I bring that up because sometimes when we are connecting with our partners, we are afraid to be vulnerable kind of like that, to let them know about our insecurities, our deficiencies. And we're afraid to let them know about these insecurities we have out of fear of how they might react. Just like we're selling a car, hey, I don't want to tell them the bad stuff because they might walk away. Maybe some of us in our relationships have some deep insecurities and vulnerabilities that we are hesitant to share with our significant other because we're afraid of how they might react. And again, I build that all up because as we look at our text here, starting in verse 5, this is the opposite of what the beloved does, right? We introduced this character last week. It's poetic literature, and the beloved is the woman in this context. The lover is the man. And so let's go ahead and look at the first few verses, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. She starts out, Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5, through the first part of verse 6. She says, I am very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem. Like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. So what is going on there in that text? Well, she starts out by telling her significant other that her skin is very tan. And here's kind of a funny thing about that culture in that day and age, that having tan skin wasn't seen as an attractive feature. Right? Isn't that wild? Right? In our culture today, to have tan skin is a good thing, but back in that day, it had certain implications. And so what this meant is she's saying, hey, my complexion, my physical beauty is not what I think it should be. Right? Don't look at me. Having tan skin meant she was probably not from a wealthy family. She was tan because she had to spend a lot of time out in the field. And she was sensitive to what the sun had done to her skin. And so she starts out here in this section by saying, hey, I am very dark. Verse 6, do not gaze at me because I am dark. And here throughout the book of Song of Solomon, there are many metaphors and illustrations to help us understand things. And here she makes the comparison of her skin to being like the tents of Kedar. And this is a reference to the son of Ishmael who became a shepherd out in the desert. And so you have a nomadic people who set up tents that were likely dark. And I think it talks about not only the color, but also the complexion of what she felt like her skin looked like. She says, don't gaze at me because I'm dark. And again, this is not a statement of race, but it's a statement of class and beauty. And so she talks in this section in a vulnerable manner, letting her lover know some insecurities she is feeling. She says, I am very dark. It's akin to saying in our culture, hey, I'm a little overweight. Please don't look too closely. It's like saying, hey, I have scars all over my body. Please don't judge. Might be like saying, hey, my hair is falling out. It's a little thinner than it used to be. You don't have to say it. I already know it, and I don't like it. As she talks about her complexion here, it's like saying, I'm not in the best of shape that I used to be. Trust me, I know. And here we see a vulnerability that she brings up to her lover. So she talks about this physical vulnerability, that she's physically unappealing, but then she talks about feeling socially unappealing. Second part of verse 6. She says, my mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. But my own vineyard I have not kept. And so she reveals some insecurity she has about her physical features and her social status. She said, hey, my family views me as a tool for production over a gift to be preserved. And so as she makes this statement, there's an implied question. Will my lover see me the same way? Just a tool to be used rather than a gift to be held? Does her value change based upon that? Right? We see some deep insecurity she's bringing up to her lover. And as you look at her background, there's a lot of people that kind of talk about what she means by my mother's sons were angry at me. We don't know. It may have been financially motivated. They may have needed her out in the field to make life work. But regardless, the point of this section of the passage is that her appearance has been marked by the sun, right? Just like yours would be if you spent all day and night out in the sun. I shouldn't say night, but just all day out in the sun. Her appearance is different. And so these first two verses 5 and 6, she is being incredibly vulnerable with her lover, letting him know her deep insecurities and kind of asking some of the implied questions, right? Are you still going to love me regardless of these things that I am insecure about? In fact, as she ends this section, she says, they made me keeper of the vineyards, i.e., I worked hard, I did a good job taking care of that field. But she says, my own vineyard I have not kept. And again, she's not talking about an actual vineyard there. She's referring to her own physical features. I took good care of everything else I need to, but I am struggling physically. I took good care of the farm, but not myself. And again, she's being vulnerable, revealing her insecurities, right? Again, it's akin to saying, hey, my body doesn't work the way it should because the work I've had to do, right? My strength is waning. I'm not super wealthy. I'm not very smart or educated. And in all of these statements that she makes and that you might make, the insecurities that you might feel, is an implied question. Will you still love me regardless of these things? Right? Will you still love me regardless of these things? And again, in our own relationships, we have insecurities and vulnerabilities that we're afraid to articulate to our spouse because we're wondering, will they view me differently? Will they still love me regardless of all these things? And what happens is our unstated insecurity creates a barrier with our romantic partners. And so if you come in today and you feel distant from your partner, maybe that is why. There's insecurities and deficiencies you feel like you have. And you're afraid that if you reveal them to your partner, they'll look at you differently. You might say, I don't trust my partner with this information. Maybe you're fearful of how they might react. And so first blank I have for you there, the fear that many of us have in our relationships is how will they respond to my deficiencies? How will they respond to my deficiencies? See, as adults, we're tempted to lie about a lot of things. Some of them relatively trivial. But sometimes we're tempted to lie to our partners, our spouses. And some of these things could be major, right? Maybe you're tempted to lie to them about money that you spent on a certain item. Maybe you're tempted to lie to them or avoid them when you failed to complete a task that you said you'd take care of. Maybe bigger issues such as infidelity. Why would we be tempted to withhold information from the person we're supposed to be the most intimate with? Right? Why do we do this? Well, the reality is if we withhold some of these items of information, it reveals what we think about them. Right? If we're afraid to tell them about money that we spent, maybe it reveals the fact that we think they're easily triggered and they're easily angered. Maybe we think that they're on the verge of leaving us, and so we don't want to disclose some of these insecurities and vulnerabilities because we're afraid they will leave us. Or our greatest fears will be realized where maybe they don't really love us or accept us. Maybe we're afraid to tell them about some of these things because we don't think they're mature enough or that they don't care. And so what I want us to realize today in our relationships, that when we're hesitant to be vulnerable with our partners, it reveals what we really think about them. Right? If you're hesitant to reveal your insecurities and vulnerabilities with your partner, maybe you don't think them trustworthy to have this information. And that creates a barrier to your relationship. Check out verse 7 of our text. She says this, "Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions?" Before we dive into that, I want to give you the next blank. I kind of skipped it there. What we see here is disclosure provides opportunities for relational growth. So in our text, first two verses, verse 5 and 6, she's disclosing these insecurities, these vulnerabilities that she feels. And then as we step into this next section, verse 7, she kind of makes a request. She wants to be in his presence. So let's kind of break down some of the imagery that she employs there. She says, "Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon." And again, she's using a common shepherding metaphor imagery. Whether or not he was involved in shepherding sheep, that's not really the issue, but what is seen there is a request. Hey, where do you stop for the afternoon and rest in the heat of the day? Right? Where do you settle, right? You're shepherding, you're moving your sheep and flock around. I need to know where you stop for a little bit because that's where you'll be less busy. That's where I can find you. And I want to find you because I want to be with you. She's requesting his presence. She says, "Why should I be like one who veils herself? I.e., I want to do everything I can to seek you out. I don't want to compete with others. And if I can't find you, I will veil myself, right? I will go into mourning without you by my side." I'm not sure if you guys got all that. Let me go back here. And so she reveals her vulnerabilities there in verse 5 and 6. And now she desires to be close to her significant other. Why? Well, she needs to feel his acceptance. She needs to feel his presence physically, right? Even if she feels distant emotionally, she wants to be close to him. And the physical presence we said is important, but what's equally important is that relational connection, that physical security. So she reveals her insecurity, she's vulnerable with him, and she seeks out his presence because she needs to feel his acceptance. You see, the relational environment we create encourages this type of connection as well. As you reveal insecurities that you have, as you are vulnerable with your spouse or significant other, it will encourage a connection that is beyond just a physical connection. The relational environment we create encourages this. And so what our challenge we see here in this text, in these few simple verses, is we are called to be present and to be vulnerable. We're called to be both present, you got to show up, you got to be around, but you're also called to be vulnerable, sharing those insecurities, those perceived weaknesses, those deep things that you feel in your life, because those two things paired together will draw you closer. And what I really want to lean into today is the emphasis on the physical presence and support. Because next week, we're going to kind of get into some of the verbal support, but today what we're leaning into is the physical presence. And so for today, if you walk in the doors and your relationship with your spouse isn't what it feels like it should be or could be, or you want to simply grow in your relationship with them, one of the first and most important things you could do is to be present, right? Show up. And what this means is carving out intentional time to be together, right? We're all busy. We're always following one busy season after another busy season, but the reality is you need to make that intentional time to connect with the person that you're married to. So you need to show up, right? That's part of the battle, show up. And when you do show up, you need to be fully present. That's why we see that request there in verse 7, right? Where do you pasture your sheep, right? You're not going to be busy chasing them around anymore. You're going to be pausing for a second. I'll have your full attention. And for us, not only is it showing up, but it's giving them our full attention, right? Turning the TV off, setting the phone down, looking them in the eye and having a real conversation with them. So our challenge is to be present, but to also be vulnerable. Articulate those insecurities you have. Trust them with that burden that you carry. Right here we see in verse 5 and 6, she articulates, hey, I'm a little insecure about how I look. And it bothers me, and I need to know, do you love me and trust me for all of my weaknesses? Articulate your insecurities. Trust them with the burdens that you have. And on the other end, as your significant other does this to you, express the support. Hey, I love you regardless of what you look like. I love you regardless of your social status. I love you regardless of how you've messed up, because I am committed to this relationship. And I'm telling you, your significant other needs to know that and to feel it. So here we see in these few simple verses, a woman who's incredibly vulnerable with her lover, seeking out his presence, because these things will grow a relationship. They're fundamental to a relationship. And for us today, I encourage you in all of our relationships to be present and to be vulnerable. As I mentioned on that school bus, just an adult sitting there changes the environment. But again, sometimes that adult has to stand up and address some issues. They have to make a connection to change that environment. And so do we as well. In our relationships, we need to show up. We need to be present, but we also need to be vulnerable and trust them with our insecurities. Got two questions, I should say, as we finish up our time, just for you to reflect on and maybe a good conversation for you to have with your spouse this week. Question number 1, what insecurities are creating a barrier between you and your romantic partner? And question number 2, what would vulnerability and presence look like in your context? Let's bow our heads in order of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this text and this reminder of, frankly, how our relationships are to function. Lord, sometimes we are not present as we are called to be. And even when we do show up, we're not present there in the moment. We're distracted by other things. And so, Lord, I just pray for our marriages. Lord, I pray that as we draw closer to you, you would draw us closer to each other. Lord, help us to trust our significant others with those things that weigh on us, those insecurities we feel. Because, Lord, you've called us to love each other, to be vulnerable with each other. And so, Lord, may we do that. And as we draw closer to each other, draw us closer to you. We love you. In your name, amen.